All right, good morning. So we're going to get started. So, good morning. Friends, countrymen. So we're going to start this panel, and this panel is on Native education. One thing I'm really happy about is we have three beautiful Native women who often the Native women, they're called the backbone. But this morning I feel that we're backing them up for this morning. So we have Nora Dauenhauer, Vida Davis, and Ann Johnson that are going to share today. In addition to all these wonderful efforts and presentations, this Native education panel, it will show multiple strategies. It's a multidisciplinary effort to really go into Native culture, with spending time with the older people as the essential part of it. But there are also other efforts, documentation, using the documentation from the past, using technology from today, using different forms that may not have started indigenous, but those other forms of knowledge and ways of being and knowing can support the indigenous. So let's just get started. It's a little bit of a record time for a start. It's as early as it's started. We'll start off with Alyssa Borges from the Gold Belt Heritage Foundation. And I just want to say that Gold Belt Heritage Foundation has been outstanding support for this conference. They funded bringing tradition bearers here, and they've given multiple wonderful presentations. So really thanks to Gold Belt Heritage Foundation, Diane Kedienti Leiti, and the staff there. So Gunashish. So why don't we just have Alyssa. Gunashish.
Good morning. My name is Alyssa Borges, and as you've heard, I work for Gold Belt Heritage Foundation. My primary role there is to write curriculum, which are the units and lessons that we hope teachers will use in the schools in Juneau and other areas in Southeast Alaska. Before I joined Gold Belt Heritage, I was a teacher in Juneau. I taught for 14 years. Primarily grades 3 through 5. I've lived in Juneau for 23 years, and today I'm just here to share what I've been working on most recently. I want to say before I begin that I am a learner, and in order to do what I'm doing, I learn from people on a daily basis. Multiple people are teaching me, and that's the support I need in order to do this work. So I want to say at the outset here that since I am new to this, I don't intend to say anything or present anything that is offensive, and I hope that anyone that feels comfortable enough will help to educate me, because I am a lifelong learner in this process. I have been working on some units that are more around food sovereignties. So one unit that I worked on was a seaweed unit, and that was in collaboration with other people, which would teach the ecology and the ecosystem and habitat, as well as traditional way of harvesting. So that's something I've done in the past. What I'm going to share today is something a little different. what I've been looking at are oral narratives and how rich these oral narratives are and how they can provide a learning experience for all children that is deep and meaningful. And what I hope to show is the depth of knowledge that's embedded in these stories and how these stories can provide a springboard for learning the academic standards that we're expecting kids to learn in the classroom. And by that I mean what they have to learn in science, what they have to learn in language arts, math, all those subjects. So these units aren't complete. Most of what I'm going to share is just the research that I put into it and what I believe our students will come away with. I've been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to consult with Richard and Nora Dauenhauer on identifying some stories that would work well in the context of what I'm hoping to do. So with that, here we go. Okay. I don't know how that looks to you. I know there's a lot of words on there, and it's really hard for me to see on the screen, but the story titles in the far left are just a few of the stories that Richard and Nora helped me to look at. And what this chart shows are the subject areas: science, social studies, language arts, math, all those things and the content rich that you could pull from each of these stories. The far right column where it says curriculum and grade level is where that information, you would find that information in the curriculum that kids are to learn and at what grade level. And that's the standard, what we call standards-based curriculum. So for an example, if we looked at this second story down, White Raven and Water, that story has a lot of embedded science. It's the story in which Raven takes the water and as he's flying, it's dropping, and as it's dropping, it's creating rivers and other parts of the watershed. In fourth grade, students learn about the water cycle and the watershed. And this is tied into salmon habitat and what the importance of our watershed to salmon habitat. So with that story alone, it's a great springboard into this rich area of science that students are already expected to learn in Juno. Social studies as well, and there's several things in there. Language arts, with all stories, language arts at any grade level. There's a lot that can be developed in terms of reading comprehension, research, writing, oral fluency. That's when the comfort with speaking and reading out loud. And in addition to that, children would learn about intellectual property rights and how these stories were a rich part of Tlingit history and culture. There's a lot of math extensions that could be brought out with them as well. So beginning with a story, an oral narrative, provides all these jumping off points for kids to learn what they're expected to learn in school. And you can get them out there doing the science that maybe in the traditional ecological way, but also the way that they're tested on in schools. I want to look at, or just show you more in depth with the third story down, the Kadjisdu.axch story, which is a story from this place, a story that belongs to the Kiksadi. It is a story that was also published in Richard and Nora's book, Hashika. And the version that I've been reading in their book was told by A.P. Johnson in 1971, I believe, and Richard and Nora transcribed and translated it into this book. I have spent a lot of time on this story. It's an incredible story. It is so full of knowledge that it's mind-boggling in a way. I had to read this several times. This chart shows just some of the embedded knowledge that this story holds. If you're not familiar with the story, I'm just going to give you a very short explanation of the story. That I couldn't possibly, it wouldn't be right for me to tell it, but also I can't possibly explain everything that's in it. But it's the story of one of the Kiksadi's most famous ancestors named Kadjisdu.axch, who, while hunting seal was, and he encountered an extremely powerful storm that pulled them towards the open sea. And as he was with his nephews, and they fought the storm, but it was too strong, and eventually they pulled their oars in, and when they woke up, they were in a foreign land, an island somewhere that could have been somewhere it's in the North Pacific, could have been Hawaii, it could have been the Japanese Kuril Islands. He and his nephews are there for some time, long enough for him to study the stars. He would study the sunrise and sunset. He spent every day doing this. He was able to use the information that he got from studying the stars to find his way home, and they do successfully. It's an incredible story. That's just a piece of it. There's a lot of science, lots of information about wilderness survival, and daily things like how to make anchors, how to make hunting tools, how to cook. It's full of knowledge. So what this church represents is just some of that stuff. It all represents culture. So I don't have a title that says culture because it's all culture. A lot of literacy jumping off points from this story as well. So as I started studying this story, it became so big. I realized there was so much information here, it would really need to be years, I think, of studying. But at this point, I see it as a possibility of creating 5 units from one story. Language arts units, a science and math unit, a geography unit, heritage language modules that support those, as well as academic vocabulary enhancement, which is part of what our grant targets. As students learn about the science embedded in the study, a strong piece would be the astronomy. It's in the curriculum that kids are supposed to learn in 4th grade as well, or 5th grade as well as middle school. And what they'll see is that Kadjisdu.axch studied the sunrise and sunset positions for some time, and that he was collecting and recording data, and that he was able to interpret that data, and that's how he was able to find his way home. And basically, he was following the scientific process, which is what we also expect kids to do in school today. Through their learning and research, the big guiding question in the science would be, what was it that he understood? What did he know after all that studying? How did he find his way back? And this picture of Mount Inchcombe shows the sun setting. And what one would infer from the story is that Kadjisdu was brilliant, that he had in his brain incredible knowledge stored of his home, that he knew where the sun rose and set from his home at any given time in the season and the year. That it was like a computer. He had that all stored. So when he ended up in a new place, he was able to look at that same data and possibly compare it to what he knew of his home. And that helped him understand the direction he needed to go to get home. And there's a lot more to that getting home piece than just understanding the direction. But in terms of astronomy, this is a really big piece. The diagram next to it is a children's textbook illustration that's basically the same, showing the same thing in a different way. That diagram shows the path of the sun set and rise at different points in the year. And he was able to identify that. He knew when the sun stopped when it was rising and setting in the same place for some time. He recognized solstice, and he knew what that would have been like at home. So this diagram is showing the academic vocabulary, the mathematics, the science, stuff that kids are tested on. And so this link through this story, I believe, is a really helpful jumping off point to studying what kids are tested on. So academic vocabulary refers to the words and phrases that we experience in an academic setting like school. These may not be the words that we use on a daily basis, but kids have to understand them in class, and they are tested using that. So what they would come away from was understanding what is the relationship between the earth and the sun. You have to understand that to know what Kadjisdu did. They would learn that the earth's tilted on an axis, and axis is one of those academic vocabulary words, that the earth rotates or spins on this axis, and that it revolves around the sun. I want to say that as adults worldwide, this is a very hard concept to understand. And well, to some people they may have learned it in a textbook in school and memorized it. For most of us, we graduate and we don't know what that means. So this unit would help to understand that through Kadjisdu's actions. The geography is a really exciting part of this, I think, as well, because the big question really is, where did he go? This A.P. Johnson story is full of descriptions of the flora and fauna. And based on reading the story and understanding how he's describing the place, it would be a great jumping off point for students to research these areas and kind of compare it back to this book. He describes grassy areas. He has a lot of descriptions of what the land looked like. And the kids could research Hawaii and the Kuril Islands to decide what seems to match there. Understanding the Pacific Ocean currents is also in the curriculum, and that's a big, understanding how it works might also shed light on where he ended up. Another thing that in the unit that could happen would be to invite an oceanographer in to talk more about this. It also maps skills and understanding where Southeast Alaska is in relation to Russia, Japan, Hawaii. Would all be a part of learning place there. Current events could come into this as well. We are, a lot of the debris from the tsunami is beginning to wash up all over the West Coast. It's hitting Alaska. This is a massive amounts of stuff doesn't have manpower to move it. There's no one paddling a canoe. But this stuff is winding up. So this kind of research kids would be exposed to kind of come up with an argument for where they think possibly he could have wound up. Looking at deep history, A.P. Johnson doesn't mention that Kadjisdu met any people. So when were the islands first inhabited? They could research this. And what are archaeologists learning about those areas today? One really, as I was doing this research myself, a really exciting piece that I learned is that there's an archaeological project on the Kuril Islands. It's an international project. And I read the report, and one of the items that they reported really caught my attention. They said, in one of the digs on one of the islands, they uncovered something, I think they used the word mysterious, but curious, they said. And it was 2 sites on the island where sea lion skulls were placed at the cardinal directions. So they were placed at north, south, west, and east. I got really excited about that because the story details how much hunting. There was lots of sea lions there, and they harvested the sea lions. They had a lot of sea lion pelts when they returned home, and it also implies that he was studying the stars, that he must have known directions. And there's no way of proving any of this, but it's pretty exciting to think, could that have been something that Kadjisdu had left there that archaeologists are finding today? So students will look at these things. This would be an 8th grade unit. They would look at this information, they would research it. So they'd be doing active, kind of archaeological research themselves. And would present where they think maybe he went backed up with their evidence. The language arts, this is my last slide. Language arts is rich with any oral narrative. But I want to give some examples about what academic vocabulary looks like. These terms like equinox, solstice, Earth's rotation, cardinal directions, those things are what students are expected to know when they're tested. That would be embedded throughout the lessons. Reading and writing, including storytelling, their own stories. And then heritage language connects really well. And I apologize if any of that heritage language is spelled incorrectly. So I'm brief today. I just wanted to share a little bit. These aren't published units yet, but many of the stories that are out there are so rich and such, and I hope that they can be shared with students as a jumping off point to learning more about culture. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, Kadjisdu, Alyssa, and again, Kadjisdu to the Gold Belt Heritage Foundation for all their wonderful support. That's very exciting to me. I know that something like this would have been so dear to my father's heart. He worked on these kind of curriculum projects. To see the embedded science into these stories is just, it's exciting territory. And it really merits much more exploration. So thank you so much for getting that going. That's awesome. So our next presenter is Benjamin Schleifman, a good friend of mine, young carver, very talented carver. He has apprenticed under his uncles, and so that's why we wanted to hear from him today, to talk about strategies we have in modern times to learn our traditions, that apprenticeship. So, Kadjisdu, thank you, Ben. Okay, put it in there.
Jaké citát? Kadjisdu, Auntie. All right. So while I'm getting ready, Kadjisdu.axch Yech Nachatziti Ishkatan Hebrew Yadi Yan Yedi Dutch Chunk Deslan Kwana Achat Ishkahit Dauk. So my name is Benjamin. I was born in Anchorage, raised in Juneau. My family comes from Teslin, Yukon territories. We're Crow. We're also the inland frog, which is actually technically a mountain toad. So this morning I'm presenting on the apprenticeships I've taken with my uncles. However, one of the things my Uncle Jim Schoppert told me when I was a child is the term apprenticeship is not a correct term. As Lingette, we were first a student, then we were a carver, then we were a teacher. And with that in mind, I've always tried to be a student first, a student always. Regardless of where I go in my career, I will always be my uncle's students. And even though my two uncles, Uncle Kenny Jackson from Teslin, Yukon territories, and Jim Schoppert from Juneau, Alaska, were the two focal points in my career, it was my Uncle Sam Johnston, whose Tlingit name is Anyaflahash. He's the Ishkitan Ka Klein. He's the one who raised the man you see on stage. So this presentation is from my uncles. If I can find it, that is. Beg your pardon? Well, I'm just looking for it. It's on this jump drive somewhere. Yes, technology is a hindrance and a blessing. So you can see a lot of the images that I'm scrolling through. Apparently, the presentation is not on here. Well, I can go through them without the official. So it's a good thing I memorized most of the presentation. I'll start off with one of the quotes my Uncle Kenny always taught me, and that was, we can change our art form as much as we want, but if we continue to change it just for the sake of change, we'll no longer have a pure art form. Uncle Kenny was a purist. He was raised in Teslin. He didn't ever feel like the way my Uncle Jim felt like change was necessary. He didn't feel change was necessary. He embraced the past simply by continuing the same art form that his uncles taught him. And that's the great thing about my uncles. They were trained by their uncles, and they trained me in the same regard. It looks like my wife's getting the computer ready. Sweetie, it's under apprenticeship? All right. So Kenny Jackson was raised in Teslin, Yukon Territories. He's Ishkitan, just as myself. He's my great auntie's second son. Uncle Kenny never left the Yukon. He never left Teslin. He stayed home, and the furthest he would ever travel was a place called Watson Lake. And Watson Lake is technically Casca territory. His father was Casca. His mother was raised in Teslin. So his bloodlines, just like my bloodlines, come from where am I going with this? His art was directly tied to his land. He was my second teacher, keep that in mind. My Uncle Jim Schoppert was born and raised in Juneau and highly educated, got his master's degree. His master's thesis was, I believe, called The Next Evolution of Tlingit Artwork. What he did was essentially take form line and, well, if you were to take a look at a totem pole and then focus on one point, magnify it, and then separate it and turn it into a puzzle, that's my best description of Jim's work. I've got a couple examples. It does not look like the computer's getting ready. So this is a piece called Blueberries. Is that up there? Yes. So I was present in his studio during the time he was making this particular piece. It's roughly 9 feet by 9 feet. I was just a child when he was doing these pieces. I recall fondly him telling me to sit down and shut up. Bear in mind that was with the affection that only a Tlingit uncle can bear. Sit down and shut up has been told to me hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Both of my uncles who apprenticed me never gave me undue praise. Praise was never given for mediocrity, which is something I've been trying to do with my boys. Praise for the exceptional, tolerance for the mediocrity. We ready? I don't know what that means. All right. Yeah. So, my Uncle Jim, he passed on when I was still a child. I was 13 years old in 1992 when he died. So my time with Uncle Jim ended abruptly. left a huge void in my life. My primary teacher my whole life was all of a sudden gone. Fortunately, I had many other uncles who happened to be artists. Kenny Jackson, Key, most people haven't heard of Uncle Kenny, but he's one of the most gifted natural carvers I've ever met. He's, in a lot of respects, my hero. He took up the reins where Uncle Jim left off. Like I was saying earlier, Uncle Kenny, he did not embrace change. He still does not embrace change. However, he's used a lot of new mediums that he's not necessarily comfortable with. He's the first person I have ever met who used copper mesh as a inlay piece. He did that with sometimes limited success, but it was definitely utilized successfully later in his career. Uncle Kenny never became known. He never became famous. Part of that's because he just didn't have the, well, part of it's, based on geology. Teslin's a very isolated community, and part of it is Uncle Kenny just doesn't want fame or recognition. He's just happy to do his own work. So, my PowerPoint presentation. Delayed. So, officially, apprenticeships, like I said, first you were a student, then you were a carver, then you were a teacher. Another word for that is hakusti. It's our way. So, this is a picture of actually the year my Uncle Jim passed on. It's my Uncle Kenny carving a mask. Sit down, shut up. We were on logs outside of his cabin. And actually, I already read you that quote. A picture of my Uncle Jim carving a piece of a panel. He was known for carving massive abstract work. Our art form itself is abstract. However, if you further abstract the abstract, that's kind of a perfect description of Uncle Jim's work. And this is one of the favorite quotes I've ever found online. It's not one of the teachings he gave me, but there's a tremendous pressure for conformity from the collectors and scholars who want the work that fits into the classic definition of Northwest Indian art. When things don't fit their expectations, there is a raised eyebrow and a sort of suggestion of, what do we do with it now? I actually just found this quote. It's magnificent. It's Uncle Jim was a poet. He was a massive artist. He was just an incredible inspiration to me. This is one of his larger pieces that, again, I was there during the making of in his studio as a child. This piece is now on display in Kenai at the university there. So here's two examples. Early in my career, I was struggling to find my own voice, and my mothers, my sisters, they all said, copy from the masters and you'll find your own voice. So a comparative piece, mine is only 2 feet by 2 feet. However, it's multidimensional. It's not just a single layer. Mine is to the right, and it's called Through My Uncle's Hands. On occasion, I'll do a piece in memorial of my Uncle Jim. And to the left is Blueberries, which I've already shown. My Uncle Kenny has been trained to be our next coxswain since he was a child. Whether or not he'll ever take up the title is beyond me, but one of his teachings to me was always, love your sisters, love your crest. So these are my brother-sister frogs. I did them maybe 8 years ago, 10 years ago, I'm not sure. I gave them to my sister, my second oldest sister. They have eyes because love is blind, especially love for your sisters. Now, my early training, and bear in mind, my uncles didn't teach me how to design. They never taught me design work. They taught me how to use the blade. So I'm a carver first, a design artist later, and that's only really come into fruition in the last few years. So in a lot of ways, I had to backwards engineer form line design. This was an early attempt at a rattle, killer whale rattle, which is used by a dancer in Whitehorse, Yukon Territories. She's ducked the lady, and I forgot to paint a nose on. We all make mistakes. So the early attempts at Form 1 without any formal education in it have been a struggle. However, my Uncle Kenny he doesn't draw himself, he carves by instinct. So when I showed him this piece, he just kind of clapped me on the back and said, "Good job." So it's one of the few rare pieces of praise I've ever received from any of my uncles. One of the things Uncle Kenny always taught me was you don't sell clan crests. They're used for dance, they're used for ceremonies. The killer whale shuckyet on the left is it's a shuckyet for the Nachtla of the Duckloeddie in Carcross. Her name's Doris McLean. Her Tlingit name is Guna. She looks magnificent. It's got 50 ermine skins on it. The whole bonnet was made of baleen. In a lot of respects, my uncles trained me to do exactly what I need to do. They taught me how to use the baleen. They taught me how to carve the wood. They taught me how to inlay. The blowhole is actually carved silver. Later in life, after apprenticing with Doug Chilton on the Smithsonian canoe, I acquired a set of silver tools. And though you can't see the silver piece in there, it's a fun little addition to the whole shuckyet. The frog headdress you see me on the right, I thought was mine, but almost as soon as I finished it, I had my Uncle Sam try it on. That was a mistake for me. I knew from the moment he put it on his head that it was not mine, and that it was going to my uncle, which is, in the end, one of the best decisions I've ever made. He was very hesitant to support me as an artist until I started re-gifting the wealth back into our own clan and to the opposite side. So publicly, I gave this piece to him at Hakrusti celebration in Teslin. That was 2 years ago. Sorry, 5 years ago. 5, yes. Seeing my clan leader wear it and dance it gives me great pride. He loves the piece, and it kind of looks like him. It's got a nose ring, which you can't see from this particular picture. This is another piece I did for dance. One of the dancers in Mount St. Elias, he's Tekwedi, and his son is Lukachari. I can never keep the two straight. His son is Koho. Lukachari. So the Tekwedi's crest is a rather scary grizzly, or it's not grizzly bear, it's a brown bear, and it's a very scary, intimidating bear. I wanted to personalize Eli's mask by giving the eyes as his son's crest. So the eyes are Koho's. When I first picked up the jewelry vices and the jewelry tools, I thought all of my stuff would go into really intricate inlays, but no, I became a jeweler. It was an unexpected twist in my career. None of my uncles trained me to do this. And it was jewelry that actually led to being somewhat of a design artist. As soon as I started making jewelry is when I started getting even a small amount of recognition from collectors, which I don't necessarily like. I'd rather produce pieces for our own people, but things don't work out that way. We as artists can't make a living just supplying our own people with crests and dance items, pieces for ceremony. So I became a jeweler. These two pieces were first. The one on the left is called Frog Mother, Kadjisdu.axch. It went to my mother, Jackie Schoppert. She's standing in the back, who I see is not wearing the piece. The piece on the right is actually, a killer whale, and it went to Doris McLean again. She's one of my favorite elders, an amazing lady, and I wish she were here. So I've had a lifelong affection for hip-hop and punk music, which this piece is reflective of. One of our friends who actually introduced me to my wife, she's a Newback, and she's a hip-hop artist and actress. So when she asked me to make her a big piece of rapper bling, I jumped at the chance. Gave her the deal of a lifetime for introducing me to my wife. It's really quite large. It's 6.5 inches, which for a piece of jewelry is, we jokingly call it the hubcap. So Allison is a Newpak. She's from Kaktovik, Alaska, and she was adopted into the, not the Kadjisdu, but the Cheney family in cake. We thought she'd be a frog, however, she became a hummingbird. So I mistakenly gave her sun rays frogs. Little mistake, but it's a personal touch from me, I suppose. Inside it is a polar bear in form line with 2 crossed microphones. I thought it was a fun touch. I really love seeing this piece used, and Allison's a pretty productive performer, so she uses it a lot. However, she also touches it entirely too much. So copper gets affected by the oils in our skin. My Uncle Jim always told me, don't be afraid of carving with your imagination. If you're going to scare people, you're going to scare people. When you look at the old pieces, a lot of them were quite frightening. They were intended to be frightening. However, they were also intended to raise our spirits. So I started acquiring new skill sets and using different mediums, such as porcupine quills for inlay. This particular piece I've jokingly called the Bearded Lady. Porcupine quills were used for the goatee and for the eyebrows, and there's roughly 85 quills per eyebrow, which is a whole lot of hand drilling. Like my Uncle Kenny always said, masks are to be danced, not hung on the walls for rich collectors. These 2 pieces, one's the eclipse moon, partial eclipse, and the other one is Keet Ka. They're both intended for dance. However, the killer whale man is danced. I haven't found the correct answer with the moon. They're both birchwood. They're both from the same chunk of wood, the same round. I was fortunate enough to apprentice with 2 carvers outside of my uncle's. One was Doug Chilton, the other one was Israel Shotridge. So Israel is standing in the back, and that's his house post in Anchorage. This is jewelry after Israel, so you can see his tutelage has increased my form line abilities, and I think I've got 2 more slides. This is a piece I did for wholesale. I do not sell crests, so it's just a series of S shapes and ovoids, a whole lot of cross hatching. This is my wedding bracelet, the female grizzly bear, and the male frog on a wedding cedar mat. My wife's is in silver. And this is where I'm kind of heading now. My Uncle Jim always told me you have to know where you're coming from to know where you're going. And my father's side comes from Brooklyn, New York, and I've been combining illicit street graffiti with Tlingit form line for years. I'm finally doing it legitimately, not on people's walls. So this is actually a piece from my upcoming show that opens up this Friday in Anchorage. It's called Just Another Frog on the Wall, and it's a homage to my Brooklyn, New York roots and my Teslin, Yukon Territory roots. And I just wanted to say that if anybody wants to apprentice, don't wait for the State Council of the Arts apprenticeship grants, because you'll just never learn. If you want to apprentice, just find somebody. They'll teach you, and if not, you'll find somebody else. And with that, my presentation is over. So, Kadjisdu.axch.
All right. Wow. Native education, it's just that traditional way of learning from the uncles. It's good to have that voice. It's really good to have that voice. And you see it in Benjamin's bearing and his learning and his art. So it's, Kadjisdu, thank you for that. So our next guests are 2 wonderful teachers, Vida Davis and Ann Johnson. Vida of the Dauenhauer her children are Klinkamo, just like me. So it's and I've had the pleasure of just spending some time with them very recently, learning from them, hearing stories from them, and I would love to hear Vida and Ann talk about their spending time with the tradition bearers, with the elders, learning from them, and how they've stepped into that role of being educators. And Ann Johnson of the Dauenhauer. So, and sheesh. Maybe we'll have you sit here. Hello? All right.
Good morning. Did you guys want to get out of bed this morning? I didn't either, so you and I are in the same boat. I'm going to speak mostly in English because there's not very many Tlingit-speaking people here this morning. However, I sweated for 3 days dreading this morning, but you know, this is home turf, and I'm glad to see everybody here, and I especially like to say welcome to Kadjisdu Marie. She's my favorite elder from Juneau. Good morning, Marie. And of course, you all know who my other half is. He's been shining ever since this workshop started, Herman Davis. I see my caretaker throughout this whole program. This workshop didn't arrive this morning. I think I ran her ragged. Her name is Jamie Bradley. She is Ann's Dauenhauer little girl, so I like to just let you guys know that she's been my biggest support throughout this workshop. Her name is, her English name is Jamie Bradley. So I'd like to have you give her a hand even though she's not here. And my other caretaker, he takes care of me 24/7 at home, but I'd like to bring him forward. Stand up, please. Michael, he is a Tlinkamo. And I'd like to publicly say thank you to both of them. Thank you very much. Well, Hu aya tush kadawati da kunta khasiti eka akhta khishu tunik ta khasuna de ta khasiti de kadet khatau julutli ha akhshat khitin ka akhun akhi akh. I still have trouble with the brothership, so I just leave it alone, but I shouldn't. You know, my two older brothers too, we were just snapped away from our families that wanted to take care of us. But you know, back in the old days, the welfare thought it was very proper to put you in an orphanage, and that's how I ended up down here. But you know, getting away from Jesus, Eguven, Hasiku, Adi, Hawkeye, Kathasko, Katushat, Aye, Utika, Katikla, Daktintan, Kadakseo, Katsuslingitsai, our Toasqueen, Kakoniki, taste that get away you, Katanki, Hoshaku, a tuna hook, Hatuawat, Gunachish, Ateneati, Hatiho, Huyas Utat. And in closing, You know, we always encourage our young people, don't give up on your culture, right? Yeah, you know, and first of all, too, I want to say to the young people very frankly this morning, do not use alcohol or even experiment. I was a slave for 45 years under that, and it's no good. It's no good for you. It's not good for your culture either, or for whoever you are. And leave smoking alone. It's no good. I am a victim of both. It's always good to search out your elders before they're gone. Are you going to go to their grave next week if they should die and say, how did you say that again? You got to ask them questions. Now, I've been very passionate about this ever since I started emceeing for New Klein, and I still am. I really still am. And before I finish my talking, I'm going to sing you a song. And my little granddaughter, when she was little, now she's 24. Don't tell her I said little granddaughter. She's going to say, gee willikers. Anyway, she loved even green eggs and ham, and every day I'd read that book to her, and there was a series of songs that she liked. So I'd like to sing you one this morning, and it has a little moral behind it, and I like using it to our kindergarten and preschool kids. I'm going to put this mic down because I have a fairly loud voice, and I don't need it. Okay, if you know the song, just hum along with me. I think I taped it for Duffy when we were in Juneau the last time. So, Duffy, are you here? Did you learn it? Did you learn it? Oh, it's just a short one. Okay, here we go. Did that spider ever give up when he fell down? See, you young people, that's what you got to do. You got to stick to your school out. Don't leave because you find it so boring. You know, you got to learn to ask questions. Don't ever leave because look at these intelligent people sitting around you. Look around for a minute. They're not only Caucasians, they're Slinkit scholars and very learned people. And I'm very happy to sit here today, this morning. So that concludes my speech. I'll hand it to my very best friend, Coach Tom.
I'm very honored to be here this morning. The only thing I'm reluctant about is the clan leader's been talking for days where you don't introduce yourself and you don't talk about yourself. But they've asked me to talk about myself and Native education. My father died when I was about 4 or 5, and my grandmother raised me because my mother had to go to work. And she always worked with us and taught us things. To me, Native education is about the beading, the food gathering, and the dancing and the stories. I always come back to the stories. I always tell them at work, we have our own stories, which we do, that come from our clan. I was born and raised here in Sitka, but my family comes from Klukwan. And I've always been interested in education because my grandmother always talked about it. The elders always talked about education. When I was younger, I didn't know what they were talking about, but I must have listened anyway. They always felt it was important that the kids learn, and everything was always for the future generation. That's one thing I couldn't understand. I thought, why are they worried about the future generation? But now I know. And the one thing that started me in my culture was my one daughter, she asked me, she said, are you ashamed of who we are? And I thought about that, and I said, no. She said, well, how come you don't talk about it? But when I was growing up is when my mother forbid us to even speak it because we had to go to school, and they didn't want us speaking Tlingit in the school. But my grandmother was always there, and she didn't speak very much English. And that's how I learned it. And we work for the Native Education Program, and a lot we've learned from Charlie Joseph, and the elders. He used to tell Vida and I, he said, you never quit learning. He said, even he was 89, he said, I'm still learning. And I feel that way too about this conference. I sat in on some of the younger teachers, and I was really amazed at what they do. And I thought, I'm still learning, because I thought there's things that I can do with the kids in class that I never thought about doing because I was watching these younger teachers. Thank you.
Kadjisdu.axch. Wow, thank you so much. You see, these is examples for us. Their reticence, their humility, and so Kadjisdu.axch, to hear from you, it's just very special. So, all right. Kadjisdu.axch. All right, our next presenter is Steve Brown. He was given the Wrangel Stakhin Kwan Kiksadi name of Kadjisdu.axch. Now, if you're familiar with that name, it's the name of one of the greatest artists in the world, I believe, and who carved the posts of the whale house, who carved the Nanya Ayi, Chief Sheikh's posts, who carved many, many masterworks. Now, some of the clan leaders might have said, we don't use the term art. My feeling is that whether it's called art or not, it's just beautiful human expression. And so it's just a real pleasure to have Steve here and talk about the work of Kadjisdu.axch. Kadjisdu.
Okay, which one? It's this one. Okay.
While it's getting set up, I'll just say a few things. Number one, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Kadjisdu.axch, to the organizers and everybody who's helped out. And also that I'd like to ask the permission or the indulgence of the clan leaders to talk about these things in a detached, academic sort of way, because I understand in my heart the concept of atu and things being paid for by the lives of the ancestors, and that certainly means a lot to me. But in the interest of sharing some experience with this person's work, I need to devolve into academic speak. Briefly, yeah. And it's going to be difficult to do any pointing from this position, but I'll try. Oh, terrific. I'm portable. Technology is definitely a love-hate relationship, isn't it? So the other thing is, although Ishmael, of course, did a beautiful job of pronouncing that name, I notice among non-Tlingit speakers there's sometimes a bit of a glitch. So I want to practice a little bit. As I heard the name pronounced by my teacher, Herb Bradley, of the Stakhin Kiksadi, it's Kadjisdu.axch. So say it with me. 2 syllables at a time. Kadjisdu.axch. Great. There's no W in there. It's not watch. It's du.axch. Okay. So This is really in the nature of a little detective work because the old-timers never signed their work in any way, for the most part. The signature in a chill cap blanket being one of the exceptions, apparently. And part of that's because they had no written language method of writing their name, but they could have made a mark of some sort, like the Chilkat robe example, but they didn't. Now, how come was that? Well, that's one reason, but the other reason is because it wasn't about them. It was about what the object was for. And, of course, those things differ. So some of the things I'll be showing fall into the category of at'u, and other things were probably privately owned by individual people. So the detective work thing it's a little bit like trying to identify someone by their handwriting alone. So you have a bunch of papers written by different people, documents and what have you, in longhand, and you're trying to sort them out based on their the way they write, their handwriting style. And you can do that. You could isolate out the writings of one particular individual based on their handwriting. And this is very similar to that. So I start with this group of objects with which we identify this man, although there's no documentation, written documentation, to connect him with this work. There is, in respect to the posts of the whale house, and that's been written in two or three or maybe more locations, the most elaborate of which was recorded by SOK, Louis Shotridge, transcribing information from, I believe, Yehak, who was, I think, the Hitsati of the whale house in the early 20th century. And SOK was, as an ethnographer, was really good at transcribing or recording things. He was less good of a theoretician, but the legacy of what he bothered to write down, because he understood the culture, he understood the language, was a part of it, is a tremendous resource compared to what you get from the non-native ethnographers. But anyway, here, what I want to do in looking at these, because of time, I'm not going to talk about crests, I'm not going to talk about imagery for the most part, briefly, but what I want to look at is the style of the work. And to do this handwriting analysis, I'm looking at sort of three different things. They're all tied in together, but one of them is the sculptural style, and that's such as looking at an individual face like this, or parts of a carving, face here, faces here in the octopus, and so on like that. Another thing is composition. Artists in this world compose their images in different ways and sort of consistent ways, and that's the other thing. And the last one is two-dimensional style. There's not much what I will call flat design on here, but there are examples. Here are the fins of this dogfish. The name of this house is Hatku Hit, which is dogfish house. It's not shark house. That would be Toos Hit. So these are dogfish. Here's the head of the dogfish, the eyes, the mouth. You only see the corners of the mouth on each side of the face. And then here's an upside down small dogfish on this side. There was one on that side, and a small human face here. You can just see the ear of it to know there was one there. And there's a little bit of hair pegged in next to the ear as well to show that it actually had hair on it. And then over here, but sort of beneath the dogfish is an upside down figure and a salmon in the top corner, what appear to be salmon in the lower corner, and they're in two-dimensional flat design style. Here used to be the tail of the dogfish was pegged on through that hole. It was a separate piece extended down over this face. And when we did Wayne Price and Will Burkhart and I did the replications of these in 84 to 86, we reproduced these based on some other old stuff. But anyway, so we're going to look closer briefly at some of those details. These are the other two posts from that house, posts representing primarily human figures. What appears to be the Gunakadate story on this side. Here's the man has a whale tail in his mouth, and the skin of the Gunakadate is draped over his head. Here's the head of the Gunakadate, the pectoral fins of the Gunakadate, the body going behind his ears there, and the tail here. This side has a similar headdress, which is, again, a compositional thing. So here's, and this is a replacement mouth and nose here that was probably done in the 30s. But that's the head of a dogfish, like a dogfish headdress. There are gill slits on the sides, pectoral fins here, and the asymmetrical tail on each side with a face carved in it. This is a bear yake type thing. It's highly eroded because of the history of these poles, which I won't go into at this moment. And then, so we're going to look more closely at these two-dimensional features as we go along. Here's another view of that same house post. This was a frog coming out of the mouth. You can just, one side over here shows the detail. The other side is eroded. The yake of the bear has a frog coming out of his mouth, highly eroded. But the eye socket, the corner of the mouth, and all that is quite clear over here. And there used to be, there's just a little shelf and a peg hole there. There used to be ears that were attached, so we had to replace all those parts. But looking at it compositionally, the other picture is the pole that's over in the Sheldon Jackson Museum that came from Taquan, which is now Metlakatla. And it was standing there in 1887 when the Tsimshians and Mr. Duncan arrived. And there used to be another figure on top. You can see here's the foreleg, the hind leg, and the feet of that other figure wrapped around the head in a similar way to the headdress of this, what might be a shaman, or probably is a shaman. So compositionally they're similar. The sculpture of the face, although the eyes are smaller, the nose is much smaller on this one, and the lips are not as fulsome, the sculptural approach that was used to make this face is very similar to this one. Here's a frog on the chest of this figure with the frog feet down over the shoulders. Here the hands of the shaman are draped over the shoulders of the humanoid bear yake, and the knees and feet of the yake are down below here. So in one of the means of dating this work is related to this pole. And the head of the figure up here was completely eroded by 1887. It was just a bunch of shrubbery. So it was cut off when the pole was moved from Metlakatla to Sitka to reside in the Sheldon Jackson Museum. So the degree of weathering that it had in 1887 is about the same as poles that were from the area that we know are 100 years old and more, like, for example, the collection in the Totem Heritage Center. They were standing, they were carved in the 1860s, 70s, 80s. They were removed from Old Kasan in 1970, so some of them 100 years old. And the degree of weathering on those poles at a century of age is about the same as this was in 1887. So that pushes the work back into the 1770s, 1780s, maybe as late as 1790s for this work here. So that's how I date these things. Another view of the Taquan face there. The photo's backwards because Peter and others will recognize that this crack, I think, is on the other side of the face, in fact. But nonetheless, you can see the compositional form there of the face with the limbs of the other figure wrapped around it, the creature on the chest, the way the arms and hands sit in a sort of a rectilineal fashion, whatnot. And then you can also see a similar kind of composition over here. So how to connect that to other works? Well, this is Old Kassan down on Prince of Wales Island, the last of the Tlingit villages to be moved into, for lack of a better word, by the Haida, Kaigani Haida, who came across Dixon Entrance. So it was first Kaigani, and then Coinglas, Haukan, Klinkwan, and all those, and the last one was this one. So I don't know, here standing among all these very characteristically 19th century Haida poles is this one, which obviously doesn't fit. It's much older than all the others. It's a different style than all the others. Clearly not Haida work. I don't know if that was standing there from when Kassan was still a Tlingit village, or if the first inhabitants, or the earlier Haida people who came over commissioned him to carve this pole way back in the 18th century. I don't know. But in looking at it, just in terms of composition, we can see some similarity. Here's a human figure. He was wearing a crest hat, which is completely eroded by this time. This is a circa 1900 photo, and a little bear or wolf positioned similarly to the house post. Here's another view of it, and a better view, and the only one that actually focuses on this pole, the others are crops from larger photos, was this one taken by a guy named LaRoche from Tacoma in, I believe, 1890. And there you can just make out the rim of the hat. There were limbs or hands of whatever creature was on the hat coming over the rim right here. Here's the figure with the big ears. I call them Cyril George ears, respectfully, that are on this figure, and that were also on the other house posts. And there's not much in the way of flat design here, but on the apron, this guy's wearing a leather apron with representation of fringe on it. The bottom of this photo here is right here in the other photo. So here's this little U shape on the apron. Here's the same one over here, and the rest of the pole down below, which includes a small human face, the design of which we used to replace the face that was missing on the house post. I heard Barry Harum tell people that I used my face on the pole at a talk he gave one time, but that's respectfully BS. It was this face that we used on the pole. At any rate, so the similarities are clear. The way he carves digits, I won't call them fingers, but they're fingers, and the way this little figure fits in there. Here, the ears were one piece, and they overlap the face. So I believe this was done after the other one. So the first time he accomplished the same thing by adding on the ears. In this one, he carved the ears out of one piece, which is sculpturally a little more complicated. So again, dating in 1890, oops, go back please, hello, there. In 1890, the degree of deterioration on this, again, indicates a century or more in age. So we're getting back before 1790 again. So now we're back to the Sheikh's tribal house post, the Khatku post. This is one of the pectoral fins of the dogfish. And it's there were other paintings on those house posts, just painted on the surface that weathered off. These house posts stood in the old village of Khasitlan, what they call Old Town in Wrangell, after the people moved up to Kadjisdu.axch, where the town of Wrangell is located now. And they were weathered. I don't think the people conceived of that as a permanent move. They took the roof boards and the wall boards from the house, moved up to this other place to keep an eye on the Russians who established a fort there in 1833. They didn't want them horning in on the trade on the Stikine, which was the source of their wealth. And so they went up there to kind of oversee that thing, ended up staying. And I don't think they retrieved these posts until maybe the 1860s. And another pole that came from the old village, and placed them in the tribal house on Sheikh's Island. So anyway, they received a lot of weathering, so there's only traces of paint that remain. You can find vermilion and other stuff on there. So anyway, here we see a good example of his two-dimensional style. The things I'll point out are, for one, this inner ovoid here almost fills that space. There's very little carved out area around it that would be painted blue. And that's, of course, a characteristic of 18th century style all across the northern northwest coast, but it's something we'll see consistently. The shapes, the angularity of forms, all those things. Here's the very same U shape that we saw in the other one. Now we might say, well, all designs have U shapes in them. What's the big deal? But it's the particular proportions of all these design elements that we want to look at. So here's a thin crescent that defines the outside edge of this form line and so on. And here's a circle relief. Interesting thing about the circle reliefs on those house posts, that you can see this one here, there's a V-cut carved around it, and the interior of the circle is flat. On the other side of the pole, that same element, there's a V-cut around the edge, and the whole interior of the circle is domed. And on all the house posts, on one side they're flat, on the other side they're domed. It's one possibility that there was another apprentice, another carver involved. So we might be looking at ultimately two people's work instead of one, and that's one of the problems. This is the pectoral fin of the dogfish headdress. Here you can see the gill slits on the corners of the mouth of that. U-shapes, large solid U-shapes with circle reliefs were on the flat side of the pole again. You notice you can see the adze marks out here. You can also see the adze marks in here, very fine, very smoothly done. On the lips of the main human figures, we found that the rows of adzing, there were 5 rows in an inch. So that each row is less than 1/4 of an inch in width. It's the finest adzing I've ever seen. Over here is the tail of the gonocadate next to the man's face. Here's the Cyril George ear coming down. Beautiful ears, by the way, Cyril. I'm not, this is in all respect, I'm just describing it. They say that your ears and other parts keep growing as you get older, so this is obviously an elder guy here. At any rate, we'll look at the proportion of this ovoid shape. Nearly round, slightly flat. Again, the carved out area around the inner ovoid is small. There's a small V-cut, that is to say a narrow V-cut here, slightly wider down here. That's a consistent thing. Again, now these are all things that all artists use, but in the same way that you can recognize individual artists' work today by their style, if we're just looking at proportion and shapes and stuff like that, we can begin to sort this out. Here's one of the salmon, the more sculptural version on the top of the other dogfish post. So here's the dorsal fin of the salmon. There are 2 solid U-shapes. It's hard to see in this particular picture, but we have round corners here, and in between the 2, it's just a straight V-cut. So the inner corners of those U-shapes are square. The outer corners are round. Now again, he's not the only artist to do that in this period. You can see other work that has that characteristic that clearly is not his, but it's one of the things we'll look at. And so all these things taken together can help to identify the man's work. The sculpture of the face here is something we'll look at, how much the eye socket is filled by the eye, the breadth and the shape of the eyebrows, the relationship of the mouth to the cheek, and all that stuff are things we'll look at. This is a beautiful tail of one of the 2 small dogfish. And when I first saw these, it struck me how particularly this segment of it had to kind of, and it, you know, we're blowing this picture up and all that, but it looked like they were cast in bronze to me, and they just seemed so firm and confident. It blew me away. So if the pole in tack 1 was done before these, and so on, this might be a second group of large-scale work. So this was a kind of a prodigy, you might say. We have no idea how old he was when he did these, but I suspect it was early in his career. So here's one of the other salmon from that post. Here are 2 what Holm would call tertiary U-shapes and in kind of an S form. So here's a round corner, here's the square corner. See, it's just a straight V-cut and a round corner over here because that's an S shape. Here on the end of the pectoral fin of the salmon, here's a round corner and a square corner, a round corner here. Very thin slits. The nature of the trigons. Here, a very interesting thing here, the round eye of the salmon, and it's subtle here, but the pitch of the eye, that is to say, if you put a ruler between this fine line and the bottom of the eye, the angle of that would be slightly different than the edge of the eye socket going around here. So the eyes are slightly pitched in the eye socket. Now again, a lot of carvers do that, but in not so much in flat design, which this primarily is. This is the maxillary bone of the salmon's mouth. It's how we can identify it as a fish. And down here, this is actually just another view. It's the pectoral fin from the other side. It's the mate to this one. But again, we can see here's very clearly a round corner. Here's a square corner. And here's a round corner. So again, he's sort of consistent. Now, he does it both ways. The one set we saw, they were round corner. So what about other major works? Well, this is a view, I believe this was taken in 1898, this one in 1907, of Khasatlan, the old Wrangell village. Now, before this, the village was over on the mainland south of the Stikine River mouth, but there was a split within the village. People moved over to this beautiful point of land on Zimovia Strait, about 17 miles south of Wrangell. So here's the bear, that another version of which stands in front of the Shakes Tribal House today and did since the 1860s. Another view of the bear. By this time, this is turn of the 20th century, the bear is pretty well unrecognizable, but it's the only one of these things that's still there. A spruce tree grew up around it and through it, and that's what's protecting it. So you can still see this pole there. You can still see that there was something up there, some big rotten thing is on top of that pole, but it's this bear. Everything else is gone. The lower part of actually this version of this pole is in the Wrangell Museum, although for the longest time, nobody connected with the museum knew that it was from here. Well, knew what it was, but you can identify it in one of these pictures. So that pole fell down. A shop teacher from the Wrangell Institute who had a carving group of native students, they salvaged the good half of that pole that has a series of salmon carved on it, holding onto a rope. They call it the one-legged fisherman pole. I don't know the whole story of it, sorry to say, but you could recognize that that's where it came from. Anyway, if we look at the face of this figure, here and here, and to a certain extent the composition, used to have wings coming out to a little ways on the side. They were sort of vertically arranged, and only parts of them are still there. It comes down to here. But if we compare that to this face on the dogfish, there are these two faces, the noses of which represented the dorsal fins of the dogfish. The structure of these faces, which is somewhat unusual, bulgy cheeks, it's not very deep carving, but it's pronounced that there was a square piece of abalone, abalone shell that was put in there, and a mortise to which the nose was attached. So if we go back to the other picture briefly, you can see it's the very same, hello, yeah, don't jump again, okay. The very same eye structure, the eye filling the socket, the way the teeth are, the cheeks, but here the nose exists. So actually that's the pattern we use to replace the noses on the other houseboats. But it connects this work to the same guy. So here again, there's that ovoid with the eye, beautiful eye, and the tail of the small dogfish. Here in these three lobes on the end of this pectoral fin, they're all rounded corners. So he didn't mind round corners, but he often didn't use them. The proportions of this is something we'll see again. And here's that pectoral fin we looked at earlier. This painting you can barely make out because you know how a painted surface is. When it weathers, the paint protects it for a while, and after a while the paint is standing out from the surface. And these are very, very slightly standing out from the surface, so that could be reconstructed. Anyway, so there you can see the same face to connect it stylistically. Now, here's an interesting thing. Here's one pole. Here's a second version of the same image. But it really looks like a different style to me, although it's the same pole, probably carved at the same time. You can tell this used to have a burial in the back because there's a cavity there and these bushes are growing out of that. But again, it's an indication of maybe he had an associate or helper. This other pole standing also at Khasatlan with that beautiful poignant lean on it, hard to say. I'm inclined to think it's the same guy's work, but there's nothing survives of that pole except this and some other photographs, not as good photographs. So it's hard to know for sure. He was wearing a Klan hat and so on. But all these pictures taken in the late 19th century show objects that are 100 years old at that time. So the other major work belongs to the Kanakhtedi, the whale house people. And this is the one that Schoppert described. Yitzhak told him the story of going down Chetsubu, the Tetzadi, the whale house, going by canoe down to Old Wrangell to pick up this guy, Kadjisdu.axch of the Kiksadi, Shtukin Kiksadi, and took him back to Tlakwan. And along the way, it was said there was a historian in the canoe who was telling him the stories that he was to represent. And along the way, he used pieces of cottonwood bark. You can all find thick slabs of cotton, small shards of cottonwood bark on the beaches around here that wash down the rivers and so on. And it's really interesting stuff to carve, and you can shape it really quickly, and yet it's firm enough to support sculpture. So he made little cottonwood bark models of each of the poles as they camped along the way back up to Tlakwan. And it's the only reference like that I've ever heard. And the only person I know that ever has made cottonwood bark models is Bill Holm. He made, his studio is like a hide a house in the interior pole and the frontal pole. Both of them, he made cottonwood bark models for each of them. And he'd never heard that story at that point. So go figure. But so here, now his style has evolved a little bit. We have the same eyebrows, large square-cornered eyebrows, fairly big eyes, but the relief around the eyes is different here. Same large nose, same kind of lips, same but more elaborate style. This is a raven's tail here coming out of the mouth, and the raven's head is here. The wings are on each side. This is, I believe, also in part. Well, no, this is different. But anyway, here's another face up above. There's the famous ears again, very naturalistic, and a larger amount of two-dimensional design we had to look at. There's a similar eye that we saw there, although the form lines are somewhat thinner. Jeff will appreciate that. And the proportion of these U-shapes and whatnot, very similar. And he has a peculiar, interesting use of circle reliefs. That's very typical use there. There's the same one really here. And here there's a little U-shape, solid U-shape extended that has an ovoid shape relief in it. But we'll see these proportions again and again. This is the whale. Again, one of these represents the Dauenhauer story, I believe. Here's the head of the whale. The blowhole has a bird's face in it. And these are the pectoral fins of the whale going up. The face and the tail of the whale, again, going into the mouth of the figure above it. So if we look here, here's two little tertiary U-shapes with, in this case, rounded corners on the inside, and some other flat design work that we'll be able to recognize. Here's the bird on the bottom of the woodworm post with a large wing. There's exactly the same proportioned U-shapes that we saw on both the old Kassan and the Wrangell house posts. Here's a square-cornered U-shape right there, round corner there, square there. So he's back to that. And there's another interesting feature here that wasn't on the Wrangell post, but you see on other works that are in Cluck 1, not necessarily by him. And that is that here, well, actually it doesn't work on this one. It shows up on some others, though. I'll mention that at a different time. Over here, the face of the Kanakadate guy with the whale coming out of his mouth. Faces in the eyes, and if we look at the details, the way this face is constructed, we'll see examples of that again. So here's something completely different. This is a guardian figure from a shaman's grave. It's about this high. It's now in the American Museum of Natural History. And I think this little frog with the interesting tip in the eye socket, these otters coming over his shoulder and around his waist, the composition, again, is a factor here, the way the hands and feet are, faces in the knees, and so on. So I think that's his work. It was found up by Emmons up by Dry Bay. And now we're getting into the smaller objects. So this is a well-known thing, and we've admired it for a long time, but I think it connects directly to his style. The way this eye is radically tipped within the eye socket. So the eye is sort of straight up and down. You could say that the abalone shell inlay was almost straight up and down. And yet the face, the eye socket, is tilted back on the form of the hat. And particularly we look at this flat design, the proportion of that ovoid is just about the same as the one in the salmon on the dogfish post. Here's a square-cornered U-shape here, square-cornered U-shape there, and other characteristics match his work. And this is the whale hat of Shakes, and the dorsal fin coming up here. We'll look at this face briefly and the composition of it, the way the hands and feet work and are coming up. And then the whale staff of Shakes and the dorsal fin. Again, it's the sculpture of the face, as simple as it is, seems to relate to this work and the age of it as well. So then we'll go beyond. What else can we connect to those, since I'm pretty confident about those? Well, here's almost the same little set of face and the same kind of composition of the hands and feet in the ear of this raven floating on the Nass hat. And interestingly, this form line that makes up the eyebrow is handled like a two-dimensional form line in that it comes all the way down around the face, even has a little trigon there at the end of the brow. And so and that leaves the cheek design in the same position as it would be in a two-dimensional creation. And that's an interesting feature. So if he made this, he also made this, which it was a real joy to see once again in action last night in the tribal house. I'm sure this thing was very happy when it left the drawer at the Museum of the American Indian. And now it's back home and doing what it was supposed to do. Probably when they moved and they took him out of the drawer in the Bronx, he said, "Oh boy, I'm going home." We ended up in another drawer in Maryland for a while, and now he's back home. But the composition of this face is so similar to this that it's hard to deny they're the same carver. Here's the form line coming around the cheek to the bottom of the beak in the same way as this one, or very similar. And interesting composition of the human face and the hands in the ears. So a book came out in the 90s that was assembled by David Pinney, who was at the Detroit Institute of Arts in those days. He's now with the NMAI. And he illustrated this mask, which I understand is in a private collection in New York. I've never seen it in person. But when I saw that picture, it is the only mask I've ever seen that I was pretty sure can connect to his work. The face and the ears are similar. The eye is very similar. And just the sort of nature of the roundness versus firmness of the sculpture, I think, matches his work And interesting, this little crease behind the mouth, very subtle crease, is something that we see over here. This is the reconstructed face from the shaman house post in Wrangell. So the original was really weathered back to about this point, but from right here back, the corner of the eye socket, these creases behind the mouth, the leg of the frog, the lips, the eyebrow, were all there to be seen on the original quite clearly. The front of it was all eroded, and so we had to reconstruct that. But this part was all there. And interestingly, right from the ear, and here's where the ear was added on. So we had to make up this ear, but nonetheless, it can be seen to have continued. Oh, that's right. Okay. So anyway, similar. A rattle, I'll just zip through. A comb, you can see these characteristics. Another pair of combs. This dish with the wing extending out, frog in the mouth. A bent corner dish in the Burke that relates to that one. This came up at auction recently. The bottoms of these two dishes match, as do the decoration on the sides. A bowl in the Museum of Natural History. This one in the Seattle Art Museum. I'm iffy about it, but I think the flat design connects it. An interesting bowl of spruce. A chest that Steve Henriksen pointed out to me. It's in San Diego. Sides of the chest. Square corner, et cetera, et cetera. And last one, this little paintbrush holder in the Museum of Natural History. And it's a maybe, but it strikes me to think that this might have been present at the creation of all of those other things with the paintbrushes and the whole 9 yards. So thank you very much for the time.
All right, Kadjisdu, thank you so much. I wish we had way more time for this. Just beautiful stuff. As I hope you guys could see that this tradition has given birth to some of the deepest and richest human expression that you could find anywhere in the world. As you could see from the evidence, that example that Steve Brown shared. And we just have I know we're running behind, so please excuse us. We're going to have Richard and Nora talk about the oral arts. And that may take a little more effort to understand, a little more effort to see how rich and how beautiful and essential it is. In many ways, the visual arts is a universal expression. Literary arts, oral arts, just as we might want to learn ancient Greek in order to get closer to Sophocles, or we might want to learn Spanish to get closer to Pablo Neruda or Garcia Lorca. Same thing, to learn and to know, be more intimate with Kitchnach, with Sitka, with Kit Yanayi, with all these tradition bearers that Richard and Nora have worked with throughout their lives. So please give a hand for Richard and Nora. Kadjisdu.